The unlikely encounter. It was a blistering afternoon in a sleepy southern town. The kind of heat that suffocated everything in its path, making the air feel thick and almost oppressive. The sun hung in the sky like an unrelenting overseer, casting long shadows beneath the low-slung buildings that dotted the town's main street. A slight breeze stirred the dust, but it only made the heat feel more like a furnace blast. This was a place where time seemed to slow down, where nothing seemed urgent, and life moved at its own easy pace. The grocery store on the corner of Main Street was the town's heartbeat, a place where people went not just to buy food, but to engage in the simple, mundane act of community. Its worn, faded sign had once been a vibrant red but now had a faded orange hue. Its shelves, though filled with goods, were starting to show their age, much like the town itself. It wasn't just a store, it was a gathering spot for neighbors to exchange stories, share gossip, and learn about the comings and goings in the town. For many, it was a link to the past, to a time when life was simpler, and the world outside their little bubble seemed distant and unimportant. General Marcus Reed had not expected to find himself standing in the middle of this small town's grocery store, his hands clutching a jar of peanut butter like he had somehow forgotten how to choose between two nearly identical brands. After 35 years of military service, there was something surreal about this return, as if the place he had once called home no longer recognized him. He had risen from the modest beginnings of a young second lieutenant into a decorated, high-ranking officer, respected not only for his strategic mind but also for his integrity and leadership. Yet here he was, a man out of place in the very town that had once shaped him. He ran a hand over his graying beard, his thoughts wandering back to his younger self, the eager young man who had left this town in search of something bigger. Marcus had always known he was destined for something beyond the confines of his hometown, but now that he had returned, he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with the silence that surrounded him. The medals on his chest, the accolades from foreign governments, the honors from the very President of the United States, they meant little here. There were no salutes in this town. No recognition. Only the soft murmur of people going about their daily lives. The bell over the door jingled, and Marcus looked up from the jars of peanut butter to see a young white police officer entering. The man had that crisp, freshly pressed look, like he had just come from a morning shift at the academy. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid, as though he had been taught that authority could be worn like a suit. He scanned the store with a slight frown, his eyes pausing briefly as they landed on Marcus. There was something in his gaze, something almost calculating, as if he was trying to place where he had seen this man before. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Marcus could sense the officer's uncertainty. The young man shifted his weight from one foot to the other, adjusting his belt with a subtle motion, all the while keeping his eyes fixed on Marcus. The heat of the day seemed to press in around them, heightening the tension. Without breaking his gaze, the officer made his way down the aisle, his boots clicking sharply against the worn tile. When he was just a few feet away, he paused, his expression hardening as he studied Marcus, sizing him up as though trying to decide if this was a man worth noticing. After a long beat of silence, the officer spoke, his voice clipped. "Can I help you, sir?" The words were polite enough, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something unspoken. Marcus could sense it immediately, a question in the officer's voice, an assumption that had yet to be voiced. The officer's gaze flickered over Marcus briefly, noting the lack of any military insignia, the lack of any visible sign of status or rank. "Just getting some groceries," Marcus replied evenly, his tone calm and unassuming. "I live just up the road. Haven't been here in a while." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, though he tried to mask it. "I don't think I've seen you around before. You new to town?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. The question wasn't completely out of the blue, but there was something about the way the officer asked it, something that made him feel like an outsider. He couldn't help but wonder if it was the man's youth, or if it was something deeper, something inherent in the way the officer looked at him. But he didn't dwell on it. He had seen too many faces like this, too many people who judged others before they ever took the time to ask. "I grew up here," Marcus said, his voice measured. "I left for a while, but I've moved back recently. Thought it might be nice to settle down for a bit." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked Marcus over again, taking a longer, slower moment to study him. There was a strange feeling in the air, a subtle shift in the officer's posture. It wasn't the normal glance one would give a stranger, and Marcus could see the uncertainty clouding the officer's face. But then, the officer spoke again, and his words were sharp, like a crack of a whip. "Mind showing me some ID?" It was an unexpected request, one that sent a ripple through the air between them. Marcus's hand instinctively clenched around the jar of peanut butter. His military instincts flared up, but he forced himself to remain calm. In the space between them, he could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, and he knew that the young man wasn't merely asking for identification, he was searching for something else. The officer wasn't seeing a general in that moment. He was seeing something else entirely. "Is there a problem, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice now carrying the weight of something more. The officer hesitated, his eyes darting to the side as if considering the situation carefully. The air in the store seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. "I'm just doing my job," the officer muttered, almost apologetically. "I need to verify who you are. It's procedure." Marcus's gaze hardened, but he forced himself to stay still, knowing that his next words could determine how the rest of this moment would unfold. "You don't recognize me, do you?" The officer blinked, and for a moment, there was a flash of confusion in his eyes. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced down at Marcus's casual attire once again, then back to his face. His lips parted, but the words didn't come out. There was no reply, no explanation. Just silence. Marcus could feel the tension building. This officer, a young man just starting out in his career, had made an assumption based on nothing but appearance. He had no idea who Marcus was. But Marcus knew that once the officer realized who he was, everything would change. The power dynamic, the tension, the uncomfortable silence, it would all shift in an instant. "I'm General Marcus Reed," Marcus said, his voice low but carrying a quiet weight. "I served in the U.S. Army for 35 years. I think that should be enough to clear up any confusion." The officer froze, his eyes widening in surprise as the realization hit him. He blinked rapidly, trying to process the words. The moment stretched out, but it felt like an eternity. Marcus stood tall, his posture unyielding as he watched the officer's face slowly flush with embarrassment. The man had made an assumption, one that he hadn't even realized he had made until now. And now, the weight of his mistake was settling in. I didn't know, sir," the officer stammered, clearly rattled by the sudden turn of events. I apologize." Marcus gave a small nod, acknowledging the apology but not letting the officer off the hook so easily. "It's all right, officer," he said. "But I would suggest next time, you ask before you make assumptions." The officer, now visibly uncomfortable, nodded fervently, his gaze dropping to the floor as though trying to avoid eye contact. Marcus turned and made his way toward the checkout counter, the sound of his boots echoing softly on the tile floor as he left behind a young officer who had just learned a hard lesson about respect and assumptions. As Marcus stepped out of the store, the weight of the encounter lingered in the air, but for him, it wasn't just about the officer's mistake. It was about something much deeper, an encounter that had revealed the unspoken biases that lay beneath the surface, the assumptions that people carried without even realizing it. The shadow of misunderstanding. Marcus Reed walked out of the small grocery store, the door chiming behind him, and the world beyond seemed almost impossibly still. The sun, which had been so oppressive when he entered, now felt like a distant memory, as the air had shifted, thickened with the weight of the encounter. The young officer's face, a mixture of embarrassment and confusion, replayed in Marcus's mind, but he refused to let it sour him. He had faced far greater challenges in his life. This, after all, was nothing more than a misunderstanding, a product of assumptions. But even so, it stung. His truck, an old but reliable vehicle, sat parked on the curb, its faded paintwork matching the subdued colors of the town. He had only been back for a few days, but already he could sense the changes in himself. There was something about returning home that always seemed to highlight the difference between who he had become and who he had been when he left. The town had not changed much, it still had the same familiar scent of the bakery's fresh bread and the same creaking swing hanging from the large oak tree in front of the elementary school. Yet, to Marcus, it felt almost alien now, a place that no longer fit the man he had become. As he slid into the driver's seat, the cool leather against his back was a sharp contrast to the heat outside. He sat still for a moment, allowing the quiet of the vehicle to settle in around him. It had been years since he had felt this kind of peace, the kind of peace you could only get from returning to a place that, while familiar, had no expectations of you. No one here cared about the medals on his chest or the stories he had to tell. The people he once called friends were long gone, replaced by new faces, and while there was comfort in that, there was also loneliness. The officer's words still lingered, though. The slight suspicion in the young man's voice, the hesitancy to acknowledge him as anything other than a stranger. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a reflection of a deeper, often invisible prejudice that ran through so many people, especially in places like this. Small towns, where the world outside felt distant, where everyone knew everyone, and anyone who didn't fit the mold was viewed with caution. Marcus had seen it before, time and time again, in different cities, in different countries, and in different forms. He had seen it in the glances from fellow officers when he was first promoted, the ones who doubted his leadership, not because he wasn't capable, but because of the color of his skin. He had felt it in the subtle undermining of his authority, the disbelieving stares, the silent judgment. And while he had learned to rise above it over the years, it still cut deep when it came from a young man who, by all accounts, was supposed to be someone who had been taught better. Shaking his head, Marcus put the truck in gear and slowly pulled away from the curb. The streets of the town unfolded before him like a worn-out map, each turn familiar yet strangely out of place. He knew where the old school was, where the park where he had spent countless hours as a child stood, but none of it felt like home anymore. It felt like a place he had been invited to visit, a place that didn't recognize the person he had become, and that made all the difference. The small park at the edge of town was the first stop. It was where he had spent most of his childhood, running with his friends until the sun dipped below the horizon. It hadn't changed much, some new swings had been added, and the old basketball court had seen better days, but the oak tree that had witnessed all their secrets and whispered dreams was still standing strong. Marcus parked near the edge of the lot and sat in the truck for a moment, gazing at the tree, the massive branches swaying gently in the breeze. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to relax, his fingers tapping softly on the steering wheel. He thought about the officer again, the young man who had questioned him in the store. The way he had scrutinized him, not out of malice but out of something else, something more insidious. The officer was probably a good person, someone who followed the rules and thought he was doing his job by checking up on someone who looked out of place. But the assumption had been made before the question was asked, the judgment cast before the facts were known. And that, in a small town like this, was something Marcus had come to understand as a constant. But there was also something else, something deeper, that troubled him. The officer's uncertainty, his hesitation, spoke volumes. It was as if he was unsure of his own place in this small world. Perhaps it wasn't just about Marcus, perhaps it was about the officer himself, trying to navigate his role in a community that demanded a kind of conformity, a place where even the smallest deviation from the norm raised suspicion. The thought made Marcus sigh. It was an uncomfortable realization that came not from a place of anger but from understanding. Small towns had their own unspoken rules, their own boundaries, and anyone who dared to cross them, even inadvertently, became an outsider. It wasn't just about race, it was about difference, about being someone who didn't fit into the neat, predictable boxes that people in these towns were used to. Marcus wasn't just a soldier, he was a man who had seen the world in ways that few others ever would. And that made him stand out, whether he wanted it or not. After a while, Marcus shook off the weight of the thoughts and stepped out of the truck. The air outside was heavy, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. He stood still for a moment, allowing the breeze to cool his face, and then began walking toward the old oak tree. The ground beneath his feet felt familiar, like he could still remember every inch of it, every scrape on his knees from his childhood games. As he stood beneath the tree, Marcus closed his eyes and let the sounds of the town wash over him, the distant hum of a lawnmower, the soft laughter of children playing somewhere down the street, the faint murmur of a conversation drifting from the porch of a nearby house. It was all so ordinary. Yet it felt foreign to him, and that made him wonder whether the passage of time had truly changed him, or whether the world had simply moved on without him. He had spent his life fighting for what he believed in, facing challenges that had shaped him, not just as a soldier but as a man. But now, in this small town, he found himself at a crossroads. What was he supposed to do here? What was his role now that he had returned? The answer didn't come immediately, and maybe it wouldn't come for some time. But as Marcus stood there, beneath the great oak tree, he realized something important. The young officer at the grocery store had made his mistake based on assumptions and fear, but that didn't mean he couldn't learn. That didn't mean he couldn't change. And maybe, just maybe, Marcus's return to this town wasn't just about finding peace for himself. Perhaps it was about showing others that change was possible, that things could be different, if only people were willing to see beyond the surface. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, Marcus turned and walked back to his truck. He wasn't sure where his path would lead from here, but he knew one thing for certain: this town, with all its quiet prejudices and old-fashioned ways, needed him. And perhaps it was time to help them see what he had learned all those years in the service. It was time to teach them that assumptions, no matter how small, could be dangerous. It was time for him to step into the next chapter of his life, the winds of change. The days following his encounter at the grocery store were a strange mix of introspection and the quiet rhythm of small-town life. The hot, lazy afternoons seemed to stretch endlessly, each one melding into the next with little distinction. Marcus Reed had always been a man of action, of forward momentum, yet here, in this place, the idea of change seemed distant. The town had its own pace, its own way of doing things, and despite his best efforts, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that it would take more than a single person's return to alter the course of a community steeped in history and tradition. He spent his mornings at the local diner, an old establishment that had served the same eggs, bacon, and coffee for decades, sitting in the same booth near the window where he had sat as a young man. The owner, Mrs. Hattie, who had run the diner since before Marcus had left, greeted him with a knowing smile every time he walked in. Her face had aged like the wooden tables, but her eyes still gleamed with the same curiosity she had when he was a child. "I see you're back again today, Marcus," she said with a wink, setting a cup of coffee down in front of him. "Don't tell me you're planning to stay around here. You're not the kind of man who enjoys sitting still for too long." Marcus smiled, taking the mug in his hands, feeling the warmth seep into his palms. It was a comfort he hadn't realized he needed until this moment. "I don't know, Mrs. Hattie. I'm still figuring that part out." She raised an eyebrow, her expression turning serious for a moment. "Well, don't take too long. You've got a lot of people here who've been waiting to see what you'll do." The words stuck with him. Waiting. Marcus hadn't thought about it like that. The people in this town, his neighbors, the faces that had been here all his life, had been waiting. Waiting for what? Waiting for him to return, to somehow pick up the threads of their shared past and bring it back to life? He couldn't deny it. He felt the weight of their eyes on him, the silent expectation. They knew who he had been. But did they know who he was now? Did he even know who he was in this town, now that he had left so much behind? The truth was, Marcus didn't have the answers. What he did know was that he couldn't just sit by and wait for something to change. He had spent too many years taking command, making decisions that shaped lives. He had been trained to act, to lead, to inspire. And yet, in this town, he felt like an observer, someone who was caught between his past and the future that seemed to be waiting just out of reach. One afternoon, after another long breakfast at the diner, Marcus decided to take a walk through the town. He needed to clear his head, to try and understand what this place wanted from him. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, stretching shadows across the sidewalks, and the town felt sleepy, almost like a place stuck in time. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional car passing by and the distant chatter of people gathered on their porches. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to change, and yet everything was constantly in motion. As he walked, Marcus found himself heading toward the old town square, the heart of the community. It had always been a place where festivals were held, where families came together for picnics, and where the town's history was on display for everyone to see. It was a place of tradition, but as he stepped onto the cobblestone path that led through the center of the square, Marcus couldn't help but notice how much it had faded over the years. The fountain at the center, once a bustling gathering place for children during the summer months, now stood dry and cracked, its once vibrant tiles chipped and worn. The benches, which used to be polished and well-maintained, were now splintered, with peeling paint and rust gathering along the edges. It was a place that had been neglected, just like the town itself, left to fade into the past. It was here, in the shadow of the fountain, that Marcus saw him again, the young officer who had stopped him at the grocery store. The officer was sitting on one of the benches, his back straight but his posture slumped with an air of defeat. He hadn't noticed Marcus yet, so Marcus took a moment to observe him from a distance. The young man was staring at the ground, his hand resting on his knee, his uniform slightly rumpled, as if he had been sitting there for a while. Marcus hesitated. He could easily turn around and walk in the other direction, avoid the officer altogether. But something stopped him. He didn't know what it was exactly, perhaps it was the guilt in the officer's posture, the way he seemed lost in thought, but Marcus knew he couldn't ignore this moment. Taking a deep breath, Marcus made his way toward the bench, his boots clicking softly against the cobblestones. The officer looked up as he approached, his expression quickly shifting to one of discomfort as he realized who was walking toward him. "General Reed," the officer said, his voice tentative, almost unsure. "I didn't expect to see you here." Marcus smiled, a small, knowing smile, and sat down on the bench next to the officer. The young man shifted slightly, giving Marcus space, but neither of them spoke for a long moment. The air between them felt heavy, but there was something about the silence that felt natural, as if they both understood that words could wait. Finally, Marcus spoke, breaking the quiet. "You don't have to keep apologizing, you know." The officer looked at him in surprise, his eyes widening. "I didn't mean." "I know what you meant," Marcus interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "You made a mistake. But mistakes don't define you. It's what you do after that counts." The officer remained silent for a moment, his gaze dropping back to the ground. "I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know what to do here. I'm new, and I thought maybe. I don't know." "You're trying to fit into a place that's been the same for years," Marcus said, his voice calm but carrying a weight of understanding. "Small towns don't like change. People here like things to stay predictable. They don't know what to do with someone who doesn't fit the mold. But that doesn't mean you have to change who you are to fit in." The officer glanced at him, as if considering his words. "I don't know if I can do that. I've always followed the rules. And here, the rules, they're different. People expect certain things." "They do," Marcus agreed. "But that doesn't mean you have to follow them blindly. Not everything that's always been done is right. Sometimes, the rules need to be challenged. The officer nodded slowly, digesting Marcus's words. I don't want to be the guy who makes things harder for everyone else. But I also don't want to be the guy who just goes along with whatever everyone else does. Then you'll figure it out, Marcus said with a reassuring smile. It's not about perfection. It's about doing what's right. They sat in silence again, but this time, the weight of it was different. There was understanding between them now, a mutual respect. Marcus, with his lifetime of experience, had faced challenges in every corner of the world. The officer, just starting his own journey, was still learning. But perhaps they both had something to teach each other. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting a soft golden light across the town square, Marcus stood up, ready to move on. Take care of yourself, officer, he said, offering a nod. And remember, you don't have to face everything alone. The officer looked up at him, a small but genuine smile tugging at his lips. Thanks, General. I'll keep that in mind. Marcus turned and walked away, his boots quiet on the cobblestone path. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in days, he felt like the town was no longer a place to escape from. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was a place where he could make a difference after all. The weight of legacy. The days that followed were both invigorating and frustrating for Marcus Reed. There was a strange energy in the air, an undercurrent that made him feel as though something was shifting, but it was subtle, so faint that it could easily be overlooked. For someone who had spent decades in the military, a life of rapid decisions and constant action, the pace of life in this small town was suffocating. But there was something else, something deeper that Marcus couldn't quite put his finger on. It was the weight of legacy, the feeling that, no matter what he did, his past, both as a soldier and a man, was forever linked to this place. Marcus had always believed that a person's legacy was something they built over time, through actions, decisions, and the lives they touched. It was the reason he had stayed true to his values for so many years. But now, standing in the town square on yet another sweltering afternoon, he wondered if the legacy of a man like him could ever truly be understood in a place like this. A small town, where everyone was expected to stay in their lanes, where expectations were inherited rather than earned. As he walked through the square, Marcus noticed a group of older men sitting on the steps of the town hall, talking in low voices, exchanging stories from the past. They were the kind of men who had seen everything, who had watched the town grow and change, or in some cases, not change at all. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cobblestone path, but their faces remained etched with the experiences of years gone by. There was a familiarity in the air, one that made Marcus feel both like an insider and an outsider. They knew who he was, or at least they thought they did, but he was no longer the young man they had known. Marcus, one of the older men called out as he approached, his voice carrying a mix of respect and familiarity. Been a long time since you showed your face around here. Marcus smiled politely but didn't slow his pace. He knew these men well, had spent many afternoons in their company, talking about the weather, the war, the good old days. Their world was simple, their concerns narrow, but there was something about their presence that still held a kind of authority. I've been around, just been busy, Marcus replied, his eyes scanning the faces of the group. Life takes you in different directions. One of the men, an older gentleman with a thick white beard, stood up slowly, his knees creaking in protest. He had always been the one to lead their conversations, his voice gruff but commanding. You know, Marcus, we were just talking about you the other day. You left a big impression on this town when you went off to the army. Hell, you were the first one from around here to really make something of himself. Marcus raised an eyebrow, unsure how to respond. That's kind of you to say, Tom. Kind? Tom chuckled, but there was a glint in his eye that spoke of something deeper. It's the truth. But that's what we're getting at. We're curious what you're going to do now. You've been all over the world, fought battles we've only heard of in the news. You've made a name for yourself. But now, you're back. What's next for you? The question hung in the air, heavy and unwelcome. It was the same question Marcus had been avoiding for days. What was next? What did a man like him do after his years of service, after all the missions and accolades? What was there left to achieve in a small town, a place that had never understood what he had lived through? I'm still figuring that out, Marcus answered honestly, his voice quiet but steady. He felt a sense of responsibility to give them an answer, to provide some sense of closure or direction. But the truth was, he didn't know. Things change when you're away for a long time. And I'm trying to make sense of all of it. Tom nodded, but the others were quieter now, studying him with expressions that felt a bit too intense. I know what you mean, said another older man, his voice softer. It's funny, though, isn't it? A man goes away, serves his country, gets all those medals. But when he comes back, people start asking what he's really good for. It's like they forget the person they knew. They only see the soldier. Marcus's gaze drifted to the ground for a moment, his mind suddenly flooded with memories. The medals. The accolades. The press conferences and speeches he had given. But none of it mattered here, not in this town where people cared more about what you were doing now than what you had done in the past. It was as if his entire career, everything he had worked for, could be erased with one simple question. People don't forget, Marcus said quietly, his eyes meeting Tom's. But they don't always understand, either. What I did, what I went through, it's not something I can explain to them. And maybe they don't need to understand. Maybe it's enough that I'm back, trying to find my place again. The group fell silent, and Marcus could feel the weight of their gazes, the subtle judgment, but also the respect. It was an unspoken acknowledgement that they could never truly comprehend his experiences, yet there was something more at play here. Perhaps it was that they still saw him as the young man who had left, the one who had been destined for greatness. They didn't know the complexities of the man who had returned. And maybe they didn't need to. As the shadows grew longer, Marcus excused himself from the conversation and began walking back toward the edge of town, toward his home. The sun was setting now, casting a warm orange glow across the horizon. He could feel the questions lingering in the air, questions about what he was supposed to do, what he could still accomplish. But the truth was, he didn't know. Not yet. His thoughts drifted back to the officer, to the conversation they had shared in the park. The young man had been struggling with his place in the town, unsure of how to fit into a community that demanded conformity. Marcus had given him advice, but now, standing in the fading light, he realized that he, too, was struggling with the same thing. He had been a soldier for so long, his identity tied to the uniform and the mission, that he had forgotten what it meant to simply be himself, to be a man without the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had spent his entire life defining himself by the battles he fought and the victories he won, but now, in this town, the battles were different. The victories were smaller, less significant in the grand scheme of things. But maybe that was the point. Maybe it wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping change. Maybe, just maybe, it was about finding peace in the small things. The quiet moments, the conversations with old friends, the understanding that things didn't have to be grand to matter. Marcus paused at the edge of the town, his eyes sweeping over the familiar landscape. He had returned to this place not to relive the past but to find something new. And though the path ahead was uncertain, he knew one thing, he wasn't alone. The town, the people, even the officer in the park, they were all part of his journey now. And if he could help them see the world a little differently, if he could help them understand that change didn't have to be feared, then maybe his return wouldn't just be about finding himself. It would be about helping them find something, too. With a final glance at the fading horizon, Marcus turned and walked back toward the heart of the town, ready to face whatever came next, crossing the threshold. The following weeks in the town felt like a slow unraveling, a series of small shifts that Marcus could sense, but not yet fully understand. His presence, once unnoticed, began to stir a quiet ripple. People began to ask more questions, to seek him out in places they hadn't before, the diner, the park, even in the aisles of the grocery store. He could feel the weight of their expectations, though they never said as much. They wanted answers from him, not just about his past, but about his future. What was a man like him supposed to do when the uniform was hung up, when the medals were tucked away in a drawer? And yet, Marcus found himself caught in the quiet dissonance of wanting to move forward while carrying the heavy burden of all that had come before. He was no longer the young man eager to prove himself on the battlefield. He wasn't the officer saluted for his courage or his skill. He was something else entirely, a man learning to be himself again, stripped of the identity that had defined him for so long. It wasn't that he resented the life he had lived. On the contrary, his years of service had shaped him in ways he couldn't even articulate. But now, in the soft rhythm of small-town life, it all felt like a distant echo, a past that would forever be with him, but one he didn't know how to carry in a place like this. One late afternoon, Marcus found himself walking down the same street where he had met the officer weeks ago. The town was quiet, with the exception of the distant sound of children playing in the park. The air was thick with the promise of rain, a humid heaviness that seemed to settle over everything, making the colors of the town appear more vivid, more defined. As he approached the town square, Marcus noticed the young officer sitting alone on the same bench where they had talked before. The officer, still in uniform, looked lost in thought, his gaze distant as he stared across the street at the old church that stood at the corner. He hadn't noticed Marcus approaching, and for a moment, Marcus simply stood there, watching him. The officer's shoulders were slumped, as though the weight of something far heavier than the uniform he wore had settled upon him. The easy confidence that Marcus had first seen in him was now gone, replaced by something more uncertain. For a moment, Marcus hesitated. He wasn't sure what had happened since their last conversation, but something had changed in the officer, something that made him seem more fragile, more human than he had before. Marcus took a step forward, his boots quiet against the cobblestones. The officer looked up then, his eyes meeting Marcus's, and for a brief moment, their gazes locked, the silence between them carrying more meaning than words could express. "General Reed," the officer said, his voice low but carrying a trace of familiarity. There was no hesitation this time, no edge to his words, just a simple acknowledgement. Marcus nodded and sat down on the bench beside him. "How are you holding up, officer?" The officer exhaled a breath, his gaze drifting back to the church across the street. "I don't know. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. About this town. About my place here. About everything." Marcus nodded, feeling a flicker of understanding. He could relate to that feeling. The confusion, the disorientation that came with trying to fit into a place that didn't seem to fit him anymore. It was something he had been grappling with since the day he had returned. "Sometimes it's hard to find your place when everything around you stays the same," Marcus said, his voice quiet but steady. "But the truth is, your place doesn't have to be defined by the town, or by the people who've always known you. You don't have to fit into the mold they've made for you." The officer turned to him, his eyes searching Marcus's face. "But what if you can't get out of the mold? What if that's all people see when they look at you? A kid from here, someone who doesn't belong anywhere else?" Marcus thought for a moment, feeling the weight of his own experiences. You can't let others define you. You can't let them decide who you are, no matter how small the town, no matter how big the world. Your identity is yours to shape, but it's not just about where you come from or what you've done. It's about what you're willing to do next. The officer let out a small sigh, as if he was letting go of something that had been holding him back. "I don't know if I'm ready for that. I don't know if anyone here is ready for me to change." Marcus chuckled softly. "No one ever is. Change is hard. It's uncomfortable. But that's the thing, isn't it? Change doesn't happen when everyone is comfortable. It happens when you decide to step outside the familiar, even if it's scary. The officer nodded slowly, as though considering the idea for the first time. Maybe you're right. Maybe I've been too focused on what people expect me to be, instead of figuring out what I want to be. Marcus placed a hand on the officer's shoulder, offering a brief but reassuring squeeze. It's never too late to start figuring that out. The young man looked at Marcus, a small smile tugging at his lips. Thanks, General. I think I needed to hear that. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, the golden light casting long shadows across the town square. For Marcus, this quiet moment felt like a turning point. It wasn't about grand gestures or heroic acts, it was about small, quiet victories, the kind of victories that couldn't be measured by medals or public applause. It was about understanding that sometimes the hardest battle was against your own doubts and insecurities. And that victory, while subtle, was just as important. As the evening drew on, Marcus stood up, brushing the dust from his jeans. The officer followed suit, standing a little straighter than before. You heading out? Marcus asked, glancing toward the main street. Yeah, the officer replied, his voice carrying a renewed sense of purpose. I've got a few things to work on. Some changes to make. Marcus smiled, his eyes softening with pride. Good. You'll figure it out. As they parted ways, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had helped the officer, but in doing so, he had also helped himself. Perhaps he wasn't the only one who needed to embrace change. Maybe this town, with all its traditions and expectations, was in need of a little transformation, too. The next morning, as the sun crept through the blinds of his small house, Marcus woke to a new day, the weight of his past still there but no longer defining him. He had made peace with who he was, and who he still had the potential to be. And for the first time since returning, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. But Marcus knew that his journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. There was still more to do, more to learn, and more to give. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, he wasn't walking it alone.